My DIL blocked me for 10 years. When I got rich, she showed up with luggage. I smiled. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Cynthia, and I'm 64 years old. For the past 10 years, I haven't heard my grandchildren's voices. Not on their birthdays, not on Christmas morning, not even when little Mason took his first steps, or when Emma lost her first tooth. 10 years of complete silence, as if I had simply vanished from their lives. It wasn't my choice. I remember the last time I saw them like it was yesterday, though it was actually 2014. Emma was barely 2, her chubby fingers wrapped around a crayon as she scribbled on paper at my kitchen table. Mason was just a baby, sleeping peacefully in my arms while I rocked him by the window. The afternoon light filtered through my cheap curtains, casting a warm glow over what I thought would be many more moments like this. Mom, we need to talk. My son Brock's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. He stood in my doorway with his wife Ellery beside him, her arms crossed and her face set in that expression I'd grown to dread, the one that meant she'd been filling his head with poison again. Of course, honey. Let me just put Mason down for his nap. I moved toward the small crib I kept in my living room, the one I'd bought secondhand and painted myself in soft blue and yellow. Actually, Ellery interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass, we'll be taking the children home now. And Cynthia, we've decided it's best if you don't see them anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stopped mid-step, Mason still sleeping in my arms. What do you mean? Brock wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom, you're not a good influence on them. Ellery thinks, we think, it's better if they grow up without certain negative elements in their lives. Negative elements, that's what they called me. A negative element. Brock, I'm your mother. These are my grandchildren. My voice was barely a whisper, afraid to wake the baby, afraid to believe what I was hearing. Ellery stepped forward, her designer heels clicking on my worn linoleum floor. Let's be honest, Cynthia. You live in this tiny apartment, you work at the grocery store, and frankly, you're not the kind of grandmother we want our children to remember. They deserve better influences. I felt the room spinning around me. This woman I had tried so hard to welcome into our family, was taking my babies away from me. And my son, the boy I had worked 3 jobs to raise, the child I had sacrificed everything for, was letting her do it. Brock, please, I said, my voice breaking. I love them. I would never hurt them. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, maybe. Or remembrance of all the times I'd stayed up with him when he was sick. All the birthday parties I'd thrown with decorations made from dollar store supplies. All the ways I'd shown him love even when money was tight. But Ellery's hand touched his arm, and that moment of connection vanished. This is what's best for everyone, he said, the words sounding rehearsed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I handed Mason to his father, my hands shaking. Emma looked up from her coloring, sensing the tension in the room with that intuitive way children have. Gamma? She said, reaching her little arms toward me. Come on, sweetheart, Ellery said quickly, scooping Emma up before she could touch me. We're going home. They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam. I stood in my empty living room, staring at the crayons scattered on my table, the half-finished drawing Emma had been working on, a picture of stick figures that I now realized might be the last thing she would ever make for me. That was 10 years ago. 10 years of birthdays missed, Christmas mornings spent alone, Mother's Days that passed without so much as a phone call, 10 years of watching other grandmothers at the grocery store with their grandchildren and feeling my heart break all over again. I tried calling at first. The phone would ring and ring until Brock's voicemail picked up. Hi, you've reached the Thompson family. We're not available right now, but leave a message and we'll get back to you. Except they never did. Not to me. I sent birthday cards for the children, Christmas presents carefully chosen and wrapped. They all came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender" in Ellery's sharp handwriting. I even showed up at Emma's school once, just hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But the secretary informed me that I was on a list, not allowed to pick up or even see the children. Ellery had made sure of that. The isolation was complete. Systematic. Deliberate. My neighbors still asked about the grandkids sometimes. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who remembered when Brock was little, would inquire about Emma and Mason with genuine concern in her eyes. "How are those beautiful babies of yours, Cynthia?" she'd ask while we both checked our mail. "They're growing up so fast," I'd say, because what else could I say? That I hadn't seen them in years? That I didn't know if Emma still loved to draw or if Mason had learned to ride a bike? That their mother had decided I wasn't worthy to be in their lives? The lies became easier over time, though they never stopped hurting. I kept their pictures on my refrigerator, the old ones from before the blockade. Emma as a toddler with chocolate cake smeared on her face from her second birthday party. Mason as a newborn, so tiny and perfect in his little blue outfit. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to those pictures, telling them about my day, about the nice customer I'd helped at work, about the sunset I'd watched from my kitchen window. "Emma, honey, you would love the flowers Mrs. Chen planted in the courtyard," I'd whisper to the photo. "They're purple, just like the crayon you always used for the sky." Pathetic, maybe, but those one-sided conversations were all I had. Work became my refuge. The night shift at Daily Mart paid the bills and kept me busy when the loneliness became too overwhelming. Stocking shelves, helping late-night customers, counting inventory, simple tasks that kept my hands occupied and my mind from wandering too far into the pain. My manager, Susan, had worked there for 15 years and understood the value of reliable employees. She never asked too many questions about why I preferred the overnight shifts, why I never took vacation days, why I sometimes seemed to be fighting back tears during slow periods. "You're dependable, Cynthia," she'd tell me when the district manager came around for reviews. That's worth its weight in gold in this business. Dependable. That's what I was. Dependable and alone. But even in my isolation, I never stopped hoping. Every phone call might be Brock finally coming to his senses. Every knock at the door might be Emma and Mason, older now, wanting to meet their grandmother. Every birthday that passed was another year closer to them being old enough to make their own choices about whether to have me in their lives. I kept a small notebook where I wrote down things I wanted to tell them someday. Emma's 10th birthday. "I hope you still love to draw. I kept all your pictures." Mason's 8th birthday. "I wonder if you're as tall as your daddy was at your age. He was always climbing everything." Small hopes, quiet dreams, the kind that keep you going when everything else feels impossible. The hardest part wasn't the big holidays, though those were brutal. It was the ordinary moments. Seeing a children's book at the store and thinking Emma might like it. Hearing a little boy laugh in the grocery aisles and wondering if that's what Mason sounded like now. Watching families at the park and imagining what it would be like to push my grandchildren on the swings. I learned to live with the ache, the way you learn to live with a chronic pain. Some days were better than others. Some days I could almost pretend that the emptiness was normal, that this was simply what life looked like for women like me. But then I'd remember Emma's tiny hand in mine, or the weight of Mason sleeping against my chest, and the grief would crash over me again like a wave. 10 years of this. 10 years of being erased from my own family. But this morning, something happened that changed everything. My phone rang at 9:37 a.m., and for the first time in a decade, the caller ID showed a familiar name, Brock Thompson. My hands shook as I answered. "Hello? Mom?" His voice sounded different, strained, desperate. "Mom, we need to talk. Can we come over?" After 10 years of silence, my son was calling me. And somehow, I knew this wasn't going to be the reunion I'd dreamed of. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and they needed something from me. "Of course," I whispered. though my heart was already bracing for whatever new pain was coming my way. You know where to find me. I haven't moved. Because unlike them, I had never given up hope that someday, somehow, my family would come home. The 2 hours between Brock's call and their arrival felt like an eternity. I cleaned my small apartment twice, changed my clothes 3 times, and practiced what I might say to grandchildren who probably didn't even remember my name. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I arranged the few family photos I still displayed, wondering if Emma and Mason would recognize the woman in the pictures as their grandmother. But before they arrived, I needed to remember how we got here. Not the blocking. That was fresh pain, always sharp. I needed to remember the years before, when I believed that sacrifice was the same as love, when I thought that giving everything would somehow be enough. I was 26 when Brock was born, young enough to still believe in fairy tales, but old enough to know better. His father, Michael, had been my whole world, charming, ambitious, full of plans for our future together. We were going to build something beautiful, he promised. A family business, a big house, maybe more children after Brock. Michael died in a car accident when Brock was 3 years old. One rainy Tuesday morning, gone in an instant, leaving me with a toddler who kept asking when Daddy was coming home and bills I didn't know how to pay. The life insurance money seemed like a fortune at first, $15,000. Enough to buy time, I thought. Enough to figure out what came next. Most young widows might have used it to get by for a few months, maybe go back to school, start fresh. But I wasn't most young widows. I was Brock's mother, and that little boy deserved everything I could give him. Everything his father would have provided if he'd lived. Instead of spending the insurance money, I hid it away. Not under my mattress or in some obvious place, but in something I'd been reading about in the library. Mutual funds. The bank officer, Mr. Richardson, had looked at me skeptically when I walked in with my $15,000 in cash. Mrs. Thompson, are you sure about this? These investments can be volatile. Maybe you should consider a simple savings account. But I'd done my research during Brock's nap times, reading financial magazines I couldn't afford to buy, studying the business section of newspapers I found left behind at the diner where I waitressed. I was determined to make that money grow, to build something lasting for my son. I understand the risks, I told Mr. Richardson, signing the paperwork with hands that shook from more than nervousness. This is for my son's future. That $15,000 was the seed of everything that came later. But it was also the beginning of the most difficult years of my life. To keep that investment untouched, I had to live on what I could earn, which meant working constantly, breakfast shift at the diner, afternoons cleaning office buildings, nights stocking shelves at Daily Mart. 3 jobs to make ends meet while that insurance money sat quietly growing in accounts Brock knew nothing about. I remember the morning I realized he'd started school hungry. Really hungry. Not just, I don't want cereal, hungry. I'd been rushing between jobs, leaving him with Mrs. Patterson next door more often than I liked. And somehow I'd missed that he'd been giving his lunch to other kids because there wasn't enough food at home. "Mommy," he said that night, climbing into my lap after I'd finally made it home from the grocery store. "Tommy's mom packs him 2 sandwiches every day. Can I have 2 sandwiches?" The shame hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, hoarding money for his future while he went to school hungry in the present. But I couldn't touch those investments. They were growing, slowly but steadily, and they represented something bigger than today's lunch money. They represented the college education he deserved, the opportunities his father had wanted to give him. So I picked up a 4th job, weekend catering for a local company, serving wealthy families their dinner parties while my own son ate peanut butter sandwiches for the 3rd night in a row. The years blurred together after that. Brock grew from a toddler to a little boy to a teenager, and I aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. My back ached from lifting, standing, cleaning. My hands were permanently stained from industrial cleaning products. I fell asleep in chairs more often than in my bed, too tired to make it down the hall to my bedroom. But Brock thrived. Piano lessons, soccer teams, summer camps, all funded by my multiple jobs while the insurance money continued its quiet growth. He never knew that I sometimes went without lunch so he could have his. He never knew that I wore the same 3 dresses to every school function because new clothes meant less money for his activities. When he was 16, he started noticing things. "Mom, why don't you ever eat dinner with me anymore?" Because I was working the dinner shift at Romano's restaurant, serving families who ate together while mine sat alone. But I couldn't tell him that. "I'm not very hungry these days, sweetheart. Growing boys need more food than old ladies like me." "You're not old," he protested, but he was looking at me with new eyes. Seeing the gray in my hair that had appeared seemingly overnight, the way my uniforms hung loose on my shrinking frame, the exhaustion I couldn't quite hide anymore. "Mom, are we poor?" The question I'd been dreading for years. How do you explain to a teenager that you're both poor and not poor, that you're struggling to pay rent while sitting on investments that could solve every immediate problem? "We have everything we need," I said carefully. "And you're going to have everything you want for college." That last part was true. By the time Brock graduated high school, those investments had grown to over $60,000. Enough for state university tuition, room and board, books, everything. I'd done it. I'd kept my promise to Michael and to myself. The day I handed Brock that first tuition check, I felt like I could finally breathe. All those years of sacrifice, all those nights working while other mothers tucked their children into bed, all those missed school plays and soccer games, it had been worth it. "Mom, how did you save this much money?" Brock asked, staring at the check. I thought about telling him then. About the insurance money, about the careful investments, about how I'd been building his future $1 at a time for 15 years. But seeing the wonder in his eyes, the pride, I couldn't bear to diminish that by revealing how much I'd struggled to make it happen. "Your father left us a small insurance policy," I said instead. "I put it away for your education." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Brock went to college, graduated with honors, got a good job in marketing. He met Ellery during his senior year, a psychology major from a wealthy family who made it clear from the beginning that she had very specific ideas about what her future should look like. I was happy for him, truly. Even when Ellery's engagement ring cost more than I made in 6 months. Even when their wedding had more flowers than I'd ever seen in one place. Even when they bought a house in a neighborhood where my yearly salary wouldn't cover property taxes. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, Brock had started seeing me the way Ellery saw me, not as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success, but as an embarrassment. A reminder of humble beginnings he preferred to forget. The blocking happened gradually, then all at once. Fewer visits, shorter phone calls, excuses for why I couldn't babysit the children. And finally, that terrible afternoon when they took Emma and Mason away forever. After they left that day, after the 10 years of silence began, I threw myself back into work. But something had changed. The investments I'd barely touched during Brock's childhood, they had continued growing, compounding, multiplying. I started paying more attention to the financial news, reading investment newsletters, learning about diversification and portfolio management. The $15,000 had become $60,000 for Brock's college. Then it became $100,000, then $200,000. I lived the same modest life, worked the same jobs, wore the same old clothes. But every quarter, when the investment statements arrived in their plain white envelopes, I saw numbers that would have shocked anyone who knew me as the grocery store employee in apartment 3B. Last month, I opened one of those envelopes to find a balance that made me sit down hard on my kitchen chair. $2,400,000. Somehow, without meaning to, without planning for it, I had become wealthy. Not just comfortable, wealthy. The scared young widow who'd put $15,000 into mutual funds had accidentally built a fortune through 34 years of patient, disciplined investing. But I told no one. Not Mrs. Henderson, who worried about my heating bills. Not Susan at the grocery store, who always gave me extra hours when she knew money was tight. And certainly not the family who'd decided I wasn't good enough to be part of their lives. I kept working my shifts, paying my $800 rent, shopping for groceries with coupons. The investment statements went into a folder in my bedroom drawer, hidden behind old tax returns and insurance papers. A secret fortune that could change everything, if anyone knew it existed. This morning, before Brock's call, I had pulled out that folder one more time. $2,400,000. Money that could pay off their mortgage, send Emma and Mason to any college they wanted, buy them whatever their hearts desired. Money that represented not just luck or good investments, but 34 years of denial. 34 years of living below my means so this money could grow. 34 years of choosing the future over the present, just as I had when Brock was young. I'd been poor for so long that I'd forgotten how to be anything else. Even when the numbers on the page said otherwise, my heart still felt like that young widow counting pennies for groceries. But now, with Brock's desperate phone call echoing in my memory, I wondered if maybe it was time to stop hiding. Time to see what my family really wanted from me after 10 years of telling me I had nothing to offer them. The knock at my door came at exactly 11:30 a.m., sharp and demanding. I opened it to find Brock standing there with Ellery beside him, looking older than I'd imagined they would. But behind them, like a miracle I'd stopped believing in, were Emma and Mason. Emma was 12 now, tall and serious-looking, with dark hair that reminded me achingly of Brock at that age. Mason was 10, fidgety and curious, his eyes darting around my small apartment like he was cataloging everything he saw. "Hello, Cynthia," Ellery said, her voice carefully neutral. She was pulling suitcases behind her. Multiple suitcases. "We need to have a conversation." As I stepped aside to let them in, I caught Emma whispering to Mason, "Is this really our grandmother? The one Mom said we shouldn't remember?" And I realized that the real test was just beginning. They stood in my living room like strangers surveying unfamiliar territory. Ellery's eyes swept over my modest furniture, my discount store curtains, the small television that still had rabbit ears because cable seemed like an unnecessary luxury. Her expression was carefully controlled, but I caught the slight curl of her lip when she noticed the duct tape holding my coffee table together. "Grandmother Cynthia," Emma said hesitantly, the words sounding foreign in her mouth. "Mom said we're going to stay with you for a while." My heart clenched. Grandmother Cynthia. Not Grandma, not Nana, not any of the sweet names I'd dreamed my grandchildren might call me. A formal title that created distance even as we stood in the same small room. "Is that so?" I looked at Brock, searching his face for some explanation. He avoided my eyes, studying the worn carpet as if it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. Ellery stepped forward, her smile bright and brittle as thin ice. "We thought it was time to reconnect. Family is so important, don't you think? And with your recent good fortune, it seems like the perfect opportunity for us to spend some quality time together." Recent good fortune. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't lit. "I'm sorry, what are you referring to?" "Oh, come now, Cynthia." Ellery's laugh was musical and completely artificial. "Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned your lottery win to my friend Sarah at the grocery store. Word travels fast in a small town, you know." My blood went cold. Mrs. Patterson was nearly 80 and had been mixing up her neighbor's mail for the past 2 years. Last month she'd congratulated me on my nephew's wedding. I don't have a nephew. But somehow, her confused gossip had created a story that brought my family back to me. "The lottery," I repeated slowly, trying to understand how this misunderstanding had traveled from Mrs. Patterson's failing memory to my daughter-in-law's sudden interest in reconciliation. "Don't be modest," Ellery continued, settling herself on my couch like she owned it. "Sarah said it was quite substantial, enough to change everything for our family." Our family. After 10 years of telling me I wasn't good enough to be part of their lives, I was suddenly included again. But only because they thought I'd won money I'd never actually won. Mason wandered over to my bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of the romance novels I'd collected from garage sales over the years. "Are these all yours, Grandmother Cynthia?" "They are." I knelt down to his level, drinking in the sight of him. 10 years old now, with gap-toothed smile and curious eyes. "Do you like to read?" He nodded enthusiastically. "I'm reading chapter books now. Mom says you probably don't have any good books since you." He stopped, glancing back at Ellery with uncertainty. "Since I what, sweetheart?" "Nothing," Ellery said quickly, moving to Mason's side. "Children say the silliest things. Don't you, Mason?" But I'd heard enough to understand. They'd taught my grandchildren that I was somehow lesser, that I wouldn't have good books or good anything because of who I was. What I was. Emma had found my photo album, the one I'd kept faithfully updated with school pictures I'd somehow managed to obtain through friends of friends who knew their teachers. She was flipping through it with a frown. "Mom, you said Grandmother Cynthia forgot about us after we were little. But look, she has pictures of me from last year's school play, and Mason's soccer team photo from this season." Ellery's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. "Those must be old pictures, sweetheart. From before." Ours, but Emma was 12, old enough to read dates and smart enough to recognize her own face. "No, look, it says Emma's spring concert, 5th grade, right here in Grandmother's handwriting. That was last month." The silence in the room was deafening. Brock finally looked up from the carpet, his face pale as he realized what his daughter had discovered. For 10 years, while they'd told the children I'd forgotten them, I'd been documenting every milestone I could find evidence of, keeping their memories alive in this little album. "Where did you get these pictures?" Brock asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Does it matter?" I closed the album gently, taking it from Emma's hands. "The important thing is that you're here now." But Ellery wasn't finished with her performance. She stood up, smoothing her expensive dress, and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. "This place is so quaint. But obviously with your windfall, you'll be moving somewhere more suitable. Somewhere with room for family." "Moving?" I followed her gaze out the window, where their Mercedes sat next to my 15-year-old Honda like a judgment on my choices. "Well, naturally. You can't expect to live in a one-bedroom apartment forever. Not when you have family who could benefit from more space." She turned back to me, her smile sharp as broken glass. "We've actually been thinking about this a lot, Cynthia. Brock lost his job 3 months ago. Did he mention that?" I looked at my son, who was now examining his shoes as if they were the most fascinating objects in the world. "No, he didn't mention that." The marketing firm had cutbacks. Very sad. And of course, with the house payments and the children's activities, things have been quite tight. Ellery's voice took on a martyred tone, as if their financial troubles were some great sacrifice she was making for the world. "I'm sorry to hear that, Brock. Why didn't you call? I could have..." "Could have what?" Ellery interrupted. "You were working at a grocery store, Cynthia. What exactly could you have done?" The dismissal in her voice was like a slap, but beneath the hurt, something else was growing. A slow, cold anger that had been building for 10 years. "Anyway," Ellery continued, settling back into her performance, "when we heard about your lottery win, we thought, isn't this wonderful? Now Cynthia can help her family, really be part of Emma and Mason's lives. And of course, this tiny apartment wouldn't be appropriate for children. They need space to grow, to play. Somewhere with a yard, perhaps. Multiple bedrooms." "You want me to buy a house?" I said flatly. "We want you to buy us a house," Ellery corrected with breathtaking audacity. "All of us. One big, happy family. The children deserve to live somewhere nice, don't you think? And with your windfall, you could afford something really special, something worthy of your grandchildren." Mason had found my small collection of children's books, the ones I'd bought over the years, hoping that someday I might read them to Emma and him. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, absorbed in a picture book about a grandmother and her grandchildren baking cookies together. "I always wanted to bake with you," he said suddenly, looking up at me with eyes that were heartbreakingly like Brock's at that age. "But Mom said you were too busy working to spend time with kids." "Mason!" Ellery's voice was sharp. "Don't bother Grandmother Cynthia with silly stories." But Mason wasn't deterred. "Emma and I used to ask about you all the time. Remember, Emma? We wanted to know why we never visited Grandmother Cynthia like our friends visited their grandmas." Emma nodded, her young face serious. "Mom always said you didn't really want to see us, that you were too tired from work and stuff." The lies. 10 years of lies, fed to children who'd wanted to know their grandmother. 10 years of poison disguised as protection. "That's not true," I said quietly. "I've wanted to see you every single day since you were taken away from me." "Taken away?" Emma's eyebrows rose. "We weren't taken away. We just stopped visiting. Because your mother decided I wasn't good enough to be your grandmother anymore." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ellery's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Brock finally found his voice. "Mom, don't. Please. We're here now. That's what matters." "Are you?" I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since they'd arrived. "Are you here because you want to be? Or are you here because you think I have something you need?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Henderson watering her plants, the sound of normal life continuing while mine turned upside down once again. Finally, Ellery spoke. "I think we're getting off on the wrong foot. The children have had a long day and we're all tired. Perhaps we could discuss living arrangements later. For now, we just need somewhere to stay for a few days while we sort things out." "Living arrangements?" The phrase stuck in my throat. "Well, obviously we can't all fit in this little apartment long term, but temporarily, while we find something more suitable for the family." She gestured around my living room as if it were a homeless shelter she was graciously agreeing to occupy. And suddenly, I understood. They hadn't come here to reconcile. They hadn't come here because they'd missed me or because they wanted the children to know their grandmother. They'd come because they thought I had money, and they intended to take it. The lottery win that existed only in Mrs. Patterson's confused imagination had brought them back to me. Not love, not regret, not the desire to heal our broken family. Money. The possibility of money. "How much?" I asked quietly. "I'm sorry?" Ellery tilted her head with practiced innocence. "How much do you think I won?" She exchanged a glance with Brock, and I saw calculation in her eyes. "Well, we didn't want to pry, but Sarah mentioned it was quite substantial. Enough to change everything. Enough to buy a proper house in a good neighborhood. Somewhere the children could be proud to bring their friends. Somewhere they could be proud to bring their friends. Not somewhere I could be happy, not somewhere our family could heal. Somewhere that would reflect well on them." Mason had moved on to a book about a little boy visiting his grandmother's farm. "Look, Grandmother Cynthia, this boy gets to help his grandma feed the chickens. Do you have chickens?" "No, sweetheart. I live in an apartment. No room for chickens here. But when we move to the big house, could we get some? Please?" The hope in his voice broke my heart. These children had been fed lies about me for 10 years, but they were still children. Still capable of dreaming about grandmothers and chickens and all the things they'd been denied. "Mason, stop bothering Grandmother Cynthia with silly questions," Ellery snapped. "She's been alone for a long time. She's not used to children anymore. Not used to children, as if 10 years of forced separation had somehow erased my ability to love my own grandchildren." I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after the emotional strain of the morning. "I need to make some phone calls about the arrangements." "Of course," Ellery said brightly. "Take your time. We'll just make ourselves comfortable. Come along, children. Let's explore a bit. As they moved through my small apartment like tourists in a foreign country, I retreated to my bedroom. Behind them, I could hear Ellery's voice, low and urgent, talking to Brock about square footage and property values, and all the things that mattered more to her than the grandmother who'd spent 10 years grieving for children who were never really lost, just stolen. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone, but I didn't call anyone. Instead, I stared at the folder in my drawer, the one containing investment statements that proved I was wealthier than they could imagine. Not from the lottery they thought I'd won, but from 34 years of sacrifice and careful planning. They wanted to use me for money I didn't have, based on a lie they'd chosen to believe. But what they didn't know was that I actually had more money than they'd ever dreamed of. Money they'd never see, because they'd never ask to see me. The real question was, what was I going to do about it? The evening meal was a disaster disguised as a family dinner. I'd prepared the only thing I could manage with my modest groceries: spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread from the dollar store, and a salad made with iceberg lettuce because it was all I could afford. Simple food that had sustained me through years of living paycheck to paycheck, but clearly not what Ellery expected from a lottery winner. "This is rustic," she said, examining her plate as if I'd served her roadkill. "I suppose you haven't had time to adjust your shopping habits yet. Once we're settled in somewhere more appropriate, I can help you plan better menus, something more suitable for your new circumstances." Emma and Mason ate quietly, stealing glances at me between bites. They seemed amazed that their grandmother knew how to cook at all, which told me everything I needed to know about how I'd been portrayed in their household. "This is really good," Emma said softly, surprising everyone at the table. "It tastes like the spaghetti they serve at school, but better." "Emma," Ellery's voice carried a warning, "don't compare Grandmother Cynthia's cooking to cafeteria food." "But I like cafeteria food," Emma protested. "And I like this too. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us that Grandmother could cook?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Brock shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly fascinated by his garlic bread. Ellery's smile became so tight I thought her face might crack. We didn't know," she said finally. "Your grandmother and I haven't spent much time together over the years." That was certainly one way to put it. Mason had been unusually quiet, but now he looked up from his plate with the direct gaze that only children possess. "Grandmother Cynthia, why don't you live in a big house like other grandmas?" "Mason," Ellery snapped, "that's a rude question." "But I'm just wondering," Mason continued, undeterred by his mother's sharp tone. "Tommy's grandma has a swimming pool and a big kitchen with an island. If you won the lottery, shouldn't you have fancy stuff too?" Out of the mouths of babes. My 10-year-old grandson had just asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. If I'd really won a substantial lottery prize, why was I still living in an $800 a month apartment with duct-taped furniture? "Well," I said carefully, "sometimes it takes time to figure out what to do with unexpected money. Big decisions shouldn't be rushed." Ellery leaned forward eagerly. "Exactly. That's why family is so important during times like this. Brock and I have experience with financial planning, property investment. We can help guide you through the process." I almost laughed. Brock, who'd lost his job 3 months ago and hadn't told his own mother. Ellery, who was clearly drowning in debt, but trying to maintain appearances. These were the people who wanted to guide my financial decisions. "That's very generous of you," I said. "But I've been managing my money for quite some time now." "Managing?" Ellery's eyebrows rose. "Cynthia, no offense, but you work at a grocery store. I have a master's degree in psychology, and Brock has years of corporate experience. Surely you can see the benefit of professional guidance." Professional guidance. From people who'd driven themselves into such deep debt that they needed to move in with the grandmother they'd spent 10 years vilifying. After dinner, while Brock helped with dishes, a courtesy I suspected was Ellery's idea rather than his, she cornered me in the living room. The children had discovered my small collection of board games and were setting up Monopoly on the coffee table, arguing good-naturedly about who got to be the dog. "Cynthia, we need to discuss practicalities," Ellery said, her voice low but urgent. "This apartment is clearly temporary, but the children need stability. Emma starts 7th grade in the fall, and Mason is at a crucial age for social development. They can't be moving from place to place." "They seem to be moving just fine," I observed. "After all, they moved out of their house and into my apartment with no notice at all." Her perfect smile faltered. "That's different. That's family helping family during a difficult time." "Is it? Because it seems to me like family helping family would involve some conversation beforehand. Some asking rather than announcing." "We're asking now." But her tone suggested she was doing nothing of the sort. "The children need a proper home, Cynthia. Somewhere with space for homework and friends and all the things growing children require. You understand that, don't you?" What I understood was that she'd already spent my imaginary lottery money in her head. She'd probably been house hunting online before they'd even knocked on my door. Emma looked up from the Monopoly board. "Can I be the banker, Grandmother Cynthia? I'm really good with money. Dad always says I should be an accountant when I grow up." "Of course, sweetheart." I sat down on the floor next to her, ignoring the way Ellery's lips pursed at my willingness to play games on the carpet like a child. "How much money do we each start with?" Mason asked, sorting through the colorful bills. $1,500 each, Emma replied promptly. "That's the rules. $1,500. The same amount I struggled to save each month during the hardest years of Brock's childhood. Money that had seemed like a fortune when I was 26 and terrified, but was now just the opening stakes in a children's game. "Did you know," I said as Emma dealt out the money, "that $1,500 was exactly how much I had when your father started kindergarten?" After rent and groceries and his school supplies, that was what was left for the whole month. "Really?" Emma's eyes widened. "That doesn't seem like very much." It wasn't, but we made it work. Brock had stopped washing dishes. I could see him in the kitchen doorway, listening with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How did you make it work?" Mason asked, already moving his game piece around the board. "Very carefully. Every dollar had to count for 3 or 4 things. I learned to be creative." "What do you mean?" I thought about those years, about the careful calculations that had become second nature. "Well, for instance, when your father needed new school clothes, I would shop at thrift stores first. But I wouldn't just buy any clothes. I'd look for pieces that could work for school, for play, and for church. One shirt had to do 3 jobs." "That's smart," Emma said approvingly. "Mom always says we have to buy separate outfits for every occasion." Ellery's face flushed. "Children need appropriate clothing for different activities, Emma. It's important to dress well." "But Grandmother Cynthia's way saves money," Mason pointed out with the logical simplicity of childhood. "Then you can buy more important stuff." "Like what?" Ellery's voice had an edge now. Mason shrugged. "I don't know. Food? Books? Toys? Stuff kids actually need?" From the mouths of babes, indeed. The game continued, but I could feel tension building in the room like pressure before a storm. Ellery kept checking her phone, typing urgent messages to someone. Brock remained in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning, but really just avoiding the conversation happening in the living room. "Grandmother Cynthia," Emma said as she landed on my property and owed me rent. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you sad when we stopped visiting?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Beside me, I heard Ellery's sharp intake of breath. "Emma, that's not appropriate." "It's okay," I said quietly, meeting my granddaughter's serious gaze. "Yes, sweetheart. I was very sad." "Why did we stop coming? Mom said it was because you were too busy, but you don't seem too busy now." I glanced at Ellery, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. This was the moment she'd been dreading. when her children started asking the questions she couldn't answer without revealing her own cruelty. Sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense to children, I said carefully. Sometimes they make mistakes. Did you make a mistake? Mason asked. No, I said firmly. I never stopped wanting to see you. Not for one single day. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma and Mason exchanged glances, and I could see the wheels turning in their young minds. They were old enough to recognize inconsistencies in the stories they'd been told, old enough to start questioning the narrative that had shaped their understanding of their grandmother. Ellery stood abruptly. I think it's time for the children to get ready for bed. It's been a long day. But we're not finished with the game, Mason protested. We can finish tomorrow, I assured him. The board will still be here. As the children gathered up their things and prepared for makeshift beds on my couch and in my small den, Emma lingered behind. Grandmother Cynthia, she whispered, I'm glad we're here now. Even if our house is too small, it feels nicer than I thought it would. Nicer than she thought it would. Because she'd been taught to expect nothing good from me, nothing warm or welcoming or loving. After the children were settled and Brock had retreated to the bathroom to make phone calls about job prospects, Ellery cornered me again. You need to stop filling their heads with stories about the past, she said, her mask of politeness finally slipping. They don't need to know about your struggles or your feelings. It's confusing for them. The truth is confusing? Your version of the truth is confusing. Children need consistency, Cynthia. They need to feel secure in their family structure. And what structure is that? The one where their grandmother is erased from their lives for 10 years? The one where they're taught that loving me is somehow wrong? Her eyes flashed with something cold and calculating. The structure where everyone knows their place, where children respect their parents and don't question decisions made for their own good. And what about grandparents? What place do we have in your structure? She smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. That depends entirely on what you have to offer. There it was, the truth, finally spoken aloud. My value as a grandmother was directly tied to my perceived lottery winnings. My worth as a family member was measured in dollars and property values. I see, I said quietly. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. She turned toward the hallway, then paused. Oh, and Cynthia? Tomorrow we should start looking at houses seriously. The children are adaptable, but this living situation can't continue indefinitely. They deserve better. As she walked away, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the detritus of the evening, Monopoly money scattered on the table, dinner dishes still drying in the kitchen, the gentle sounds of my grandchildren settling in to sleep under my roof for the first time in 10 years. They deserved better. On that point, Ellery and I absolutely agreed. The question was, better than what? Better than the grandmother who'd loved them from a distance? Better than the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their father's future? Better than the lottery winner they thought I was? Or better than the mother who'd spent 10 years lying to them about love? The next morning, I woke before dawn as I had for 34 years. Old habits die hard, even when your whole world is shifting beneath your feet. I made coffee in my small kitchen, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of family sleeping in my living space, Emma's quiet breathing from the couch, Mason's occasional murmur from his makeshift bed in the den, Brock's familiar snore that hadn't changed since he was a teenager. For a moment, I allowed myself to pretend this was normal, that my grandchildren had always been part of my morning routine, that their presence wasn't the result of lies and manipulation, that we were simply a family who loved each other waking up under the same roof. But reality has a way of reasserting itself, and reality walked into my kitchen at 6:45 a.m. in the form of Ellery, perfectly dressed despite sleeping on an air mattress, her phone already glued to her ear. Yes, I understand the market is competitive, she was saying to whoever had the misfortune of being her realtor this early in the morning. But we're serious buyers. Cash buyers, actually. My mother-in-law just came into some money and we're looking for something substantial. 4 bedrooms minimum, good school district, swimming pool if possible. Cash buyers, swimming pool, 4 bedrooms. She'd spent exactly 36 hours in my apartment and was already spending my imaginary lottery winnings with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in her life. I poured myself coffee and waited for her to finish the call. When she hung up, she turned to me with that bright, artificial smile I'd grown to despise. "Good morning, Cynthia. I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of contacting a few real estate agents. There are some wonderful properties available in Willowbrook Heights. That's where we lived before Brock's. Employment situation changed. The children's friends are all in that area." Willowbrook Heights, where house prices started at $500,000 and went up from there. Where people like me, the real me, not the lottery winner she imagined, couldn't afford to drive through, let alone live. "That sounds expensive," I said mildly. "Well, of course, but you can afford it now. And really, Cynthia, after all these years of living so modestly, don't you deserve something better?" Modestly. Such a kind way to say poverty. "The children deserve something better too," she continued, warming to her theme. "Emma is at such a crucial age for social development. Living in a nice neighborhood, having friends over, being part of the right community, these things matter more than you might realize." The right community, as opposed to the wrong community, where grandmothers who worked at grocery stores raised children who somehow managed to graduate college and find successful careers anyway. Brock emerged from the bathroom, looking haggard in a way that had nothing to do with sleeping on an air mattress. He'd been making phone calls until nearly midnight, probably following up on job leads or trying to negotiate with creditors. The stress was written in the lines around his eyes, in the way he moved like a man carrying invisible weight. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to stumble into the kitchen before school, hair sticking up in every direction, needing help finding his backpack. "Any luck with the job search?" I asked. He shook his head. "Market's tough right now. Everyone's cutting back, consolidating. Experience doesn't seem to matter as much as it used to." "Something will come up," I said, though we both knew that generic reassurance was about as useful as thoughts and prayers. Ellery glanced at him with barely concealed irritation. "Well, that's actually less of a concern now, isn't it? I mean, with Cynthia's windfall, we have some breathing room to be selective. Brock doesn't need to take just any job." The casual way she dismissed his pride, his need to provide for his family, his entire professional identity. It was breathtaking in its cruelty. But what was worse was the way Brock's shoulders sagged, as if he'd been carrying this particular burden for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "Ellery," he said quietly, "we can't just assume—" "Can't assume what? That family helps family? That Cynthia wants what's best for her grandchildren?" She turned to me with eyes that glittered like cut glass. "You do want what's best for them, don't you, Cynthia?" It was a trap, beautifully laid. Say yes, and I was agreeing to fund their lifestyle indefinitely. Say no, and I was admitting I didn't care about Emma and Mason's welfare. "I want what's best for everyone," I said carefully. Emma and Mason chose that moment to wander into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee and the low murmur of adult conversation. They looked rumpled and young in their pajamas, Mason's hair sticking up exactly like his father's used to. Emma already alert and taking in the tension between the adults with the sharp awareness of a 12-year-old who'd learned to read emotional weather patterns. "Are we really going to look at houses today?" Mason asked excitedly. "Can we see one with a pool?" "We'll see, sweetheart," I said, ruffling his hair. "First, we need to have a family discussion about some important things." "What kind of important things?" Emma asked, immediately suspicious. She'd learned early to be wary of adult conversations that might affect her world. I looked at Brock, then at Ellery, Then at my grandchildren who deserved so much better than the games their parents were playing with their lives. About honesty, I said finally. About truth and lies and what family really means. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Ellery's smile faltered. Brock's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Emma and Mason looked between the adults, sensing something significant was happening but not understanding what. I walked to my bedroom and retrieved the folder I'd been hiding for so many years. My hands were steady as I returned to the kitchen, though my heart was pounding with the weight of what I was about to do. "There's something you all need to know," I said, setting the folder on my small kitchen table. "Something I probably should have told you a long time ago." "Mom?" Brock's voice was uncertain. I opened the folder and spread the investment statements across the table like playing cards. 34 years of quarterly reports, account balances, transaction histories. The paper trail of a fortune built one careful decision at a time. "I didn't win the lottery," I said quietly. Mrs. Patterson was confused, as she often is these days. There was no lottery ticket, no sudden windfall. Ellery's face went white. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "that the money exists, but it didn't come from gambling. It came from sacrifice, from 34 years of living below my means, so this money could grow." Brock leaned over the table, scanning the numbers. I watched his face change as he processed what he was seeing. "Mom, these accounts, this balance, $2,417,326, I said, as of last month's statement. The silence was deafening. Emma and Mason pressed closer, trying to understand why the adults had suddenly stopped breathing. That's more than a lottery winner," Mason said finally, his math skills sharp enough to recognize that this was more money than most people saw in their lifetimes. "Much more," I agreed. "And it represents every single sacrifice I made for 34 years. Every extra shift I worked instead of reading bedtime stories. Every vacation I didn't take. Every nice dress I didn't buy. Every dinner out I skipped. All of it went into building this." Brock's hands shook as he picked up one of the statements. The original investment, $15,000, from Dad's life insurance. "I was 26 years old and terrified," I said. "I had a 3-year-old son and no idea how to be both parents at once. But I knew that money was the last gift your father could give us, and I wasn't going to waste it on temporary comfort." "You've been rich this whole time?" Emma asked, her young mind struggling to reconcile the grandmother who lived in a tiny apartment with the numbers on these pages. "Rich in money, yes, but I chose to live poor so this wealth could exist. I chose to let you all think I was nothing special, just an old woman who worked at a grocery store and couldn't afford nice things." Ellery found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer." The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for decades. Ellery's perfect composure cracked completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. You let us struggle. You let Brock lose his job, let us face foreclosure, let the children worry about money, and you had millions of dollars just sitting there?" "No," I said firmly. "You let yourselves struggle by cutting me out of your lives. You decided 10 years ago that I wasn't worth knowing unless I could be useful to you. You taught my grandchildren that loving me was something to be ashamed of." Brock was staring at the investment statements like they were written in a foreign language. "Mom, I don't understand. All those years when I was growing up, when we barely had enough." "We had enough," I corrected. "We had exactly what we needed, and this money was growing for your future. I paid for your college with the dividends from these investments. I gave you every opportunity I could while building something bigger for the long term. But you could have made our life easier. We could have lived in a nice house, had nice things. And then what would you have learned about work? About sacrifice? About the value of money? I gestured toward Ellery, who was now openly crying. Look how she treats money she didn't earn. Look how quickly she's willing to spend wealth that belongs to someone else. Is that what you wanted to learn? Mason tugged on my sleeve. Grandmother Cynthia, are you going to buy us a house now? The question was innocent, but it cut to the heart of everything. I knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that were so much like his father's. That depends, sweetheart. Are you going to love me if I say no? He blinked, confused by the question. Of course, you're my grandma. And what if I never buy you anything? What if I just love you and spend time with you and teach you things, but I don't give you money or toys or fancy stuff? That's okay too, Emma said, though she glanced uncertainly at her mother. Isn't it, Mom? Ellery couldn't answer. She was trapped between her own greed and her children's innocent acceptance of unconditional love. Brock set down the investment statements and looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen since he was small. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. For choosing her over you. For letting her poison the kids against you. For being weak when you needed me to be strong. I know, I said simply. But now you have to choose again. And this time, your children are watching. He looked at Ellery, who was still crying but now with the desperate tears of someone who realizes their game is over. Then he looked at Emma and Mason, who were watching this adult drama unfold with the clear eyes of children who deserved better than the manipulation they'd been subjected to. What do you want me to choose? He asked. I stood up, my knees protesting but my resolve stronger than it had been in 10 years. I want you to choose truth. Choose honesty. Choose the kind of family your children deserve to be part of. And if I do? If we start over? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Then we start over, all of us, but on my terms this time. Ellery's head snapped up. What does that mean? I met her gaze steadily. It means you have until noon to decide what kind of mother you want to be. The kind who teaches her children that love can be bought, or the kind who teaches them that some things are more valuable than money. And if I choose wrong? Then you'll find out that $2 million can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy forgiveness for 10 years of cruelty. The ultimatum settled over the kitchen like dust after an explosion. For the first time in a decade, I held all the power. The question was, what was I going to do with it? Noon came faster than I expected and slower than I hoped. The hours between my ultimatum and Ellery's deadline crawled by with the weight of 34 years of careful planning finally coming to fruition. I spent the morning watching my family, really watching them, as they processed the bombshell I'd dropped into their carefully constructed world of lies. Emma and Mason, bless them, adapted with the resilience that children possess when adults finally stop lying to them. They asked direct questions and accepted direct answers. They wanted to know why I'd kept my wealth secret, why their mother had kept them away from me, why money seemed to make all the adults act so strangely. Grandmother Cynthia, Mason said as we sat together on my small couch, if you have all that money, why do you still live here? Because this is my home, I said simply. Money doesn't change where you belong. But Mom always says we need to live in the right neighborhood so people will respect us. Emma nodded sagely. She says where you live tells people what kind of person you are. I thought about that for a moment, looking around my modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and carefully mended curtains. What kind of person do you think I am, based on where I live? But they considered this seriously. These children who'd been taught to judge worth by square footage and property values. I think you're the kind of person who doesn't waste money on stuff you don't need, Emma said finally. I think you're the kind of person who saves money for important things instead of spending it on showing off, Mason added, from the mouths of babes. In 10 minutes of honest conversation, my grandchildren had understood something their mother had spent their entire lives failing to grasp. Brock spent the morning pacing my small living room like a caged animal, stopping occasionally to stare at the investment statements I'd left spread across my kitchen table. He'd built his adult life around the assumption that his mother was financially helpless, that his success had lifted him above her circumstances, that his wife's disdain for my situation was justified by objective reality. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that everything he'd believed about me, about himself, about his marriage, might be wrong. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, settling into the chair across from me. "About Ellery, I mean. How long have you known what she really thought about me, about you, about family?" "From the beginning," I said honestly. "From the day she met me and I could see her calculating my value in her head. From the first time she suggested you were too good for your raising. From the moment she started talking about improving your background." He winced as if I'd slapped him. "Why didn't you say something? Would you have listened?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of choices made and unmade. We both knew the answer. Young love, new marriage, the intoxication of being wanted by someone who seemed so far above your station. None of that leaves room for a mother's warnings about character and true intentions. "I thought she loved me," he said quietly. "She might have, in her way. But she loved what she could make you into more than who you actually were." Ellery had spent the morning in my bedroom, supposedly making phone calls but really hiding from the reality that her decade-long game was finally over. I could hear her voice through the thin walls, alternating between desperate pleading and cold calculation as she tried to salvage something from the wreckage of her plans. At 11:45, she emerged with the composed expression of someone who'd decided to make one last play for control. "I've been thinking," she announced, settling herself in my kitchen with the confidence of someone about to negotiate from a position of strength. "About our conversation this morning, about choices and family values." Emma and Mason looked up from the coloring books I'd bought them years ago and never had the chance to give them. Brock stopped pacing. I continued sipping my coffee, waiting to see what final card she thought she held. "The children need stability," she continued. "They need consistency. And while I admit that our family dynamic hasn't been perfect, disrupting their lives now would be traumatic for them." She was using the children as human shields, appealing to my love for them to protect herself from the consequences of her own actions. It was exactly what I'd expected. "What are you proposing?" I asked mildly. "A compromise. A fresh start for all of us. We acknowledge that mistakes were made on both sides." "Both sides?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "What mistakes did I make exactly?" Her composure flickered. "Well, you. You weren't transparent about your financial situation. That created misunderstandings." "I see. So my choice to live modestly and keep my finances private was a mistake. What else? You could have reached out more over the years. You could have tried harder to maintain the relationship." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "Ellery, I sent birthday cards that came back unopened. I made phone calls that went straight to voicemail. I showed up at my granddaughter's school and was told I was on a list of people not allowed to see the children. Exactly how much harder should I have tried?" That's not how I remember it." "No, I'm sure it isn't. Memory is convenient that way." Brock was staring at his wife with growing horror as he realized the full extent of her systematic cruelty. "Ellery, you told me Mom didn't want to see the kids. You said she was too busy with work to be bothered with them. I was protecting them, and protecting you. Do you remember what your life was like before you met me? Do you remember being embarrassed of your background, ashamed of where you came from?" "I was never ashamed of my mother," Brock said quietly. But even as the words left his mouth, I could see him questioning whether they were true. "Really? Then why were you so eager to move to Willowbrook Heights? Why did you want the children to attend private schools? Why did you work so hard to build a life that looked nothing like the one you grew up in?" She had him there, and she knew it. Brock had spent his adult life running from his humble beginnings, trying to become someone worthy of her love. And in the process, he'd learned to see his childhood, and by extension, me, as something to be transcended rather than treasured. "That's different," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Or is it just uncomfortable to admit that you wanted distance from this?" She gestured around my modest apartment. "That you were grateful when I gave you permission to stop pretending you enjoyed visiting your mother in her tiny apartment." The cruelty was breathtaking, but it was also illuminating. In her desperation to maintain control, Ellery was finally showing everyone exactly who she was. Emma stood up abruptly, her coloring book falling to the floor. "Stop it." All the adults turned to stare at her. At 12 years old, she was tall for her age and possessed of a quiet dignity that reminded me achingly of Brock at that same age. "Stop what, sweetheart?" Ellery asked, her voice automatically shifting to the syrupy tone she used when she wanted to appear caring. "Stop being mean to Grandmother Cynthia. Stop saying terrible things about Dad. Stop acting like we're stupid and can't see what you're doing. Emma, that's enough. Adults are trying to have a conversation." "No, you're trying to hurt people and then pretend it's for our own good." Emma's voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. "You told us Grandmother Cynthia didn't want to see us, but her whole apartment is full of our pictures. You said she didn't care about us, but she saved every single drawing we ever made in school. You said she was too poor to buy us nice things, but she has millions of dollars she never spent on herself." Mason nodded vigorously. "And you said Dad's childhood was embarrassing, but he turned out pretty good. Better than some of my friends' dads who grew up rich and still act like jerks." Ellery's perfect composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. You're children. You don't know how the world works, how important appearances are, how much harder life is when you don't have advantages." "I understand that you lied to us," Emma interrupted. "For our whole lives. About everything." The truth, delivered by a 12-year-old with the clarity that only comes from seeing adults behave badly, hung in the air like a judgment. Brock sat down heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. "Jesus, Ellery, what have we done?" "We've built a good life," she said desperately. "We've given the children opportunities, experiences. We've taught them that love is conditional," he said. "We've taught them that family isn't worth maintaining if it doesn't serve your purposes. We've taught them to be ashamed of where they came from. And we've taught them that their grandmother isn't worth knowing," I added quietly. "Unless she has something they want." The noon deadline I'd set was arbitrary, dramatic perhaps, but it had served its purpose. The pressure of time had forced everyone to show their true colors. Ellery's last-ditch manipulation attempt had backfired spectacularly, exposing her not just to me and Brock, but to her own children. "So," I said, standing up and smoothing down my simple dress, "it seems like everyone has made their choice." "What does that mean?" Ellery asked, though the fear in her eyes suggested she already knew. I walked to my bedroom and returned with my checkbook, the one connected to my main investment account, the one that could write checks for amounts that would change lives. "It means," I said, settling at my kitchen table and uncapping my pen, "that some people get second chances and some people get exactly what they've earned." I wrote the first check carefully, my handwriting steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. $25,000 made out to Brock Thompson, enough to cover their immediate debts, buy them time to figure out their next steps, start fresh. "This is for you," I said, tearing it out and handing it to my son. "To help you get back on your feet." His hands shook as he took it. "Mom, I can't accept this. Not after everything." "You can, and you will. But there are conditions." "What conditions?" I wrote a second check, this one for $50,000. "This one goes into education funds for Emma and Mason. College, trade school, whatever they choose. But it's managed by me, and it's only accessible if they maintain a relationship with their grandmother." Emma and Mason's eyes went wide. They might not fully understand the magnitude of $50,000, but they understood it was more money than they'd ever imagined having access to. "And the third condition?" Brock asked quietly. "You get counseling. Real counseling, to figure out why you chose a wife who taught your children to be ashamed of their family. To figure out why you let someone else's standards become more important than your mother's love." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And Ellery?" I looked at my daughter-in-law, soon to be former daughter-in-law if I was reading the situation correctly. She was staring at the checks with naked hunger, calculating even now how much of that money she could claim as community property. "Ellery gets exactly what she's always wanted," I said. "Freedom from association with people beneath her standards." "What does that mean?" "It means the children can choose whether they want to maintain a relationship with their mother, and you can choose whether you want to stay married to someone who taught your children that love can be bought." The silence that followed was profound. Emma and Mason looked between their parents, understanding that their family was about to change in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. Brock stared at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. And Ellery looked at those checks and made one final fatal mistake. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "We're talking about $25,000 like it's some grand gesture. Cynthia has over $2 million. This is pocket change to her." "You're right," I said calmly. "It is pocket change to me. Which is why this is all you'll ever see of it." "That's not fair. I'm Brock's wife. I'm the mother of your grandchildren. You deserve exactly nothing from me," I interrupted, my voice carrying the weight of 10 years of suppressed anger. "You stole my grandchildren from me. You taught them to be ashamed of loving me. You spent 10 years convincing them that I wasn't worth knowing, and now you want me to reward you for it? I was protecting them. No, you were protecting yourself from having to associate with people you considered beneath you. And in the process, you've raised children who've learned that family is disposable if it doesn't meet your standards." I stood up, feeling taller and stronger than I had in years. "The money will always be there for Emma and Mason, for their education, for their futures, for helping them build lives based on their own values rather than someone else's prejudices. But it will never be there for you." Ellery's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. I'll fight you. I'll take you to court, claim elder abuse, prove you're mentally incompetent." "With what money?" I asked mildly. "Court battles are expensive, and from what I understand, you're broke." She turned to Brock desperately. "Are you going to let her do this to us? To your wife? To your family?" Brock looked at her for a long moment, then at his children, then at me. "You're not my family," he said quietly. "You're someone who's been teaching my children to be ashamed of the people who love them most." And just like that, it was over. 34 years of planning, 10 years of patience, one morning of truth-telling, and the woman who'd stolen my family from me was finally facing the consequences of her choices. Emma and Mason spent the afternoon asking questions about money, about family, about why adults made things so complicated. We played board games and made grilled cheese sandwiches and talked about everything except the fact that their world had just fundamentally changed. That evening, after Ellery had packed her things and left for her sister's house in another state, after the tears and accusations and threats had finally subsided, I sat on my couch with my son and grandchildren and felt something I hadn't felt in 10 years. Peace. "Grandmother Cynthia?" Mason asked as he settled against my side. "Are we going to move to a big house now?" "Do you want to move to a big house?" He considered this seriously. "Maybe, but only if you come with us, and only if it still feels like home." I looked around my modest apartment, at the second-hand furniture and discount store curtains and duct-taped coffee table, at the investment statement still spread across my kitchen table, representing 34 years of sacrifice and patience, at my son, who was learning what it meant to choose love over appearance, at my grandchildren, who were learning that wealth means nothing without the people you care about. "You know what?" I said, pulling them both closer. "I think we're already home. $2 million could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't buy what we'd found that day. The understanding that family isn't about money or status or maintaining the right image. It's about showing up, telling the truth, and choosing love even when it's inconvenient. Even when it costs you everything else you thought you wanted. Especially then. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.